They say water always finds a way. I learned that the hard way 15 years ago when I lost nearly everything I owned in a flash flood. Back then, I lived in a quiet town in Arkansas. And one summer night, a stalled thunderstorm poured 6 inches of rain in less than 2 hours. The drainage ditch behind my house overflowed, the water crept into my basement, then surged through the main floor. I remember standing knee-deep in filthy water holding my daughter's baby photo album above my head, watching helplessly as our living room floated around me. We never fully recovered, not emotionally, not financially. That experience rewired my brain. Ever since, I've never looked at a patch of soil or a sloped driveway the same way. I read FEMA. Flood maps like novels. I could spot water pooling potential the way a hunter spots animal tracks. When I finally moved out to the foothills of Pine Hollow and bought my retirement home, I wasn't just buying land, I was buying topography. The lot sat near the bottom of a gentle incline. To most people, it was idyllic, a craftsman-style home framed by cedar trees, birdsong in the morning, and wide-open skies. But I saw what they didn't. During a hard rain, the water would sheet off the hillside, rush across the empty field behind my property, and without a place to go, collect right near the back edge of my fence. Not dangerous yet, but a red flag. So before I even finished unpacking my boxes, I designed a solution. I wasn't trying to build some huge municipal-grade storm sewer. Just a smart, discreet, gravity-fed storm drain. I dug a shallow trench about 30 feet long, starting near the rear edge of my property, sloping gently down toward the street. I laid in a 6-inch perforated pipe, wrapped in mesh, packed it with gravel, then covered it with soil and seeded it with grass. From the outside, it looked like a slightly lower patch of lawn. But during a rain, it worked like a charm. It quietly siphoned excess runoff away from my house and toward the gutter where it belonged. It wasn't connected to city infrastructure, and it didn't redirect water off my property in any unnatural way. It simply helped the land breathe. For 5 years, it worked beautifully. I never had pooling water near my home. My sump pump barely kicked on. While some of my neighbors watched their mulch float down their driveways, my place stayed solid. I didn't advertise what I'd done. It wasn't a secret, it just wasn't anyone's business. That changed on a bright Thursday morning in April. I was on my knees, pulling weeds near the front flower bed, when I heard footsteps on the sidewalk. It was Marlene, one of the HOA board members, the one who always walked her poodle in a pink visor and matching sneakers. I nodded politely. She nodded back, then stopped. Her gaze drifted toward the side of my house, where the ground dipped ever so slightly. "What's that trench for?" she asked, pointing with her leash. I glanced at where she was pointing, then stood and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Storm drain," I said. "Just helps move water down during heavy rain." Her nose wrinkled like I'd said I was burying toxic waste. "Did you submit a request for that?" "No need. It's entirely on my property. Doesn't affect the neighbors. It's basically just gravel under grass." She didn't respond right away. Her dog sniffed at a bush. Then she gave me a tight smile. Still, that sort of modification would typically require approval. "I'll bring it up with the board." And just like that, the fuse was lit. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed the HOA had bigger things to worry about than a buried pipe. But a week later, I got the email, then the certified letter, then the formal violation notice printed on letterhead, citing obscure sections of the community design guidelines that I swear weren't in the handbook I was given when I moved in. Unapproved alteration of drainage structure, potential disruption of neighborhood aesthetics, unauthorized landscaping modification subject to correction. I reread the letter 3 times. My hands trembled not with fear, but with frustration. It wasn't about rules. It was about control. They didn't care if my solution was safe. They cared that it didn't pass through them. I took a breath, then opened the old wooden cabinet where I kept my disaster files. Out came my laminated FEMA flood maps, my slope analysis from when I surveyed the land before buying, and the soil percolation tests I ran in the first year. I even had photos before, during, and after the drain construction. I printed everything, stapled it neatly, wrote a courteous cover letter. I wasn't trying to fight, I was trying to inform. I dropped it off at the HOA office myself, gave it to their assistant, a teenager with AirPods in. I smiled politely and walked back to my truck. But a part of me already knew. These people didn't want facts. They wanted obedience. Still, I waited. I gave them 2 weeks, then 3. One afternoon, I got a second letter, shorter, colder. The board has reviewed your documentation and finds the modification to be non-compliant. Please remove the drainage structure within 10 days or face daily fines. 10 days. To undo the one thing that kept my house safe from the past I still saw in my nightmares. I sat down in my garage, stared at the concrete floor, and felt the old weight pressing down on my chest, the same weight I felt that night in Arkansas as the water soaked my photographs, my furniture, my dignity. Not again, I thought. Not this time. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept replaying old images, mud curling around my ankles, the hum of the emergency generator, the silence afterward when the insurance check fell thousands short. I had spent years clawing my way back to stability, choosing this exact parcel of land for its slope, for its relative safety, for the sense of control it offered. And now, some HOA board member with a color-coded binder was threatening to undo it all with a vote and a fine schedule. But I wasn't naive. I knew how these games worked. If you screamed or stomped, they'd label you unstable or combative. If you complied too quickly, they took it as an invitation to dig deeper. So I did what I was trained to do back in my civil engineering days. I documented everything. I started with a time-stamped video of the drain working during a light rain that weekend. Just a subtle pull of water through the lawn. No splashing, no mudslide. Just nature doing what it was supposed to do with a little help. Then I took detailed photos of the entire yard marking where the drain line ran, showing how it was fully contained on my property. I printed out a packet that cross-referenced my soil reports with rainfall data from the local weather station. And finally, I included a copy of the state statute on private property drainage improvements, which thankfully backed me up. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. A week later, I received an email saying I had been added to the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. The subject line was discussion regarding unauthorized drainage system, Lot 17A. Lot 17A. Not Mr. Reynolds, not the guy who prevented flooding, just a lot number with a violation attached. The meeting was held in the neighborhood clubhouse, a beige, windowless space that always smelled faintly of off-brand Lysol and printer ink. I arrived early wearing my old field jacket and carrying my binder of documents like a shield. Slowly, the room filled with residents. Some I recognized from dog walks, others from brief waves while mowing the lawn. A few nodded politely at me. Most didn't acknowledge me at all. At the front sat the board 5 people behind a plastic table. Marlene, of course, was there sitting next to the HOA president, a man named Clint Thatcher. He looked like the kind of guy who treated a clipboard like a weapon. Polo shirt tucked in, hair immovable, reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose like they'd been surgically installed. The meeting began with rote updates about pool repairs and fence paint colors. Then came new business. Agenda item 4C, Clint announced, clearing his throat. Unauthorized drainage modification by resident of Lot A. Everyone turned to look at me. I stood, nodded stiffly, and walked to the small lectern in front of the board. I opened my binder, slowly letting the pages breathe. I'm a Tom Reynolds, I said calmly. I built a small French drain entirely on my property after studying the land's drainage patterns for over a year. It's not connected to any city infrastructure, nor does it alter or reroute runoff to neighboring properties. It's a passive system, and it prevents water from pooling near my foundation. Clint raised a hand. Mr. Reynolds, the concern is not necessarily with performance, it's with process. You made a significant landscaping change without board approval. I flipped to the statute I'd highlighted. Per State Civil Code, Section 153.22. Any non-commercial self-contained drainage solution on private property does not require HOA oversight unless it alters shared infrastructure or impacts neighboring lots. My solution does neither. Marlene sniffed loudly, cutting in. But you must understand, it doesn't look like the rest of the lawns. The board sets certain standards so the neighborhood maintains its uniform appearance. I turned another page. Actually, my front yard is untouched. The drain is grass-covered and invisible. Unless you know where to look, you wouldn't know it's there. Clint leaned forward, speaking slower now. Be that as it may, the concern is precedent. If we allow one person to make modifications without oversight, what's to stop others from installing trenches, ponds, fountains, whatever they want? The tension in the room thickened. A man in the back coughed awkwardly. Someone else whispered, "This is ridiculous." I nodded once, breathing evenly. I understand your concerns about precedent, but unlike ponds or fountains, improper water management causes real damage. I lived through a flood. I lost everything. I built this system so I wouldn't have to go through that again, and so the neighborhood wouldn't suffer runoff overflow in the process. Clint pursed his lips. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We'll take this under advisement and notify you of our decision. I stood there for another beat, letting silence press against them. Just remember, I said you can vote against nature if you want, but nature doesn't care. And with that, I walked back to my seat. The vote came 2 days later via email. It was short and sterile. The board has determined that the unapproved drainage modification must be removed within 15 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $70. I stared at the message for a full minute. Then I stood and walked out onto my back porch. The wind had shifted. Thick gray clouds were rolling in from the west, the kind that drag their bellies low across the valley like they're in no hurry. I felt the air tighten, heavy, wet. Rain was coming, and this time they'd feel it too. I didn't want a war. I wanted a dry crawl space, a safe perimeter, and to be left alone. But the board made it clear they had no interest in logic, just control. Still something in me, some leftover civility I hadn't shaken, refused to let it end there. Maybe it was the years I spent raising my daughter alone or the long days of site planning I'd done back in my engineering career where people's lives depended on details. You don't just walk away from truth when others ignore it. You try one last time to get through. So I drafted a letter. Not a rant, not a plea, just a clear professional warning. I opened with a reminder of the property layout and how runoff naturally traveled from the upper fields behind my home toward the neighborhood's lower basin right through the backyards of at least 4 other homes. I noted that when the land was developed, the city didn't install a retention pond or public drain system. Everything was left to gravity and luck. Then I included rainfall data trends from the past 5 years, showing how flash events were increasing in both frequency and intensity. Finally, I included 2 high-resolution maps, one from the Hoche County's Department of Public Works, and one that I personally annotated to show water flow paths during a 2-inch-per-hour rainfall event. In red, I highlighted the danger zones. 3 of them sat directly beneath Clint Thatcher's property line. I kept my tone neutral, almost detached. I wrote, if the current slope-based drainage system is further interrupted by removal of established mitigations, e.g., my gravel trench, there is a high probability of backyard and garage-level flooding in any rainfall exceeding 1.5 per hour. Based on NOAA projections, we are due for such an event this season. I dropped the packet off at the HOA office in person. Marlene wasn't there, but the assistant took it and promised it would be reviewed. I knew it wouldn't be, but I had to try. I also emailed it twice. No response. So I did one more thing. I called the city. Not to complain. I wasn't filing a report. I just wanted clarity. I spoke to a junior engineer at Public Works, a guy named Aiden, who seemed surprised I knew what a swale cut was or how to calculate soil permeability without lab testing. We talked for nearly 30 minutes. He confirmed that while HOAs had discretion over community aesthetics and neighborhood rules, they did not override state or county stormwater regulations. And what's more, he said, if HOA actions created a situation that led to measurable property damage during a predictable weather event, well, that could lead to liability exposure, especially if they were warned ahead of time. Would you mind putting that in writing? I asked. He chuckled. I can't give legal advice, but I'll send you a copy of the county's guidance documents. You can draw your own conclusions. I thanked him, printed the documents, and added them to my growing file. A few days later, 2 HOA contracted landscapers arrived at my property. They weren't wearing uniforms, just orange vests and frowns. One had a clipboard, the other a shovel. I met them at the side gate before they could step foot on my grass. Can I help you? We're here to begin compliance work on the unauthorized structure, clipboard guy said, reading from a sheet. I glanced at the shovel. That drain is covered by native sod. If you start digging, you'll disturb the root system and the soil stability. Sir, he said, not meeting my eyes, we were instructed to begin removal today. I folded my arms. Do you have a permit? That stopped him. He blinked. A permit to perform work that could impact the water flow across a developed property. Yes. And if you cause damage, I'll be holding your company accountable. He stepped back. I'll need to check with the HOA. You do that. They left without touching a blade of grass. But 2 days later, they came back with Clint in tow. Clint walked straight up to me like he owned the air I breathed. Mr. Reynolds, your refusal to comply is noted. If you obstruct our contractors again, we'll fine you for interference. I have documentation, I said calmly. Scientific evidence that removal could cause harm not just to me, but to multiple homes. You're creating risk. He smiled thinly. We'll take our chances. They started digging that afternoon. Ripped out the sod, tore up the trench. Gravel was shoveled out like garbage, the pipe tossed into a wheelbarrow like it was scrap. I stood on the porch and watched them dismantle something that had protected not just me, but their whole precious development, and the sky it was already graying. That night, I walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The channel I had so carefully built was gone, replaced by churned mud and tire tracks. Water had nowhere to go now. I scribbled notes in my logbook. I took time-stamped photos. Then I went back inside, sat on the floor of my study, and stared out the window at the dark clouds forming low over the ridge. I didn't feel rage, not yet. I felt something colder. I'd tried logic. I'd tried warning them. I'd tried kindness. All they heard was the sound of their own authority bouncing off the walls of their clubhouse. Now nature would speak in a language they couldn't ignore. The rain began 2 nights later. Not a storm, not at first, just the kind of slow, steady downpour that you almost don't notice until your gutters start whispering. But I noticed. I always notice. The temperature dropped, and the wind brought with it that sharp metallic smell that I recognized in my bones, saturated earth. I stood on the back porch, watching droplets stitch silver lines across the wooden railing. My boots sank a half-inch into the lawn with every step. The ground was already near saturation, and the forecast said the main system would hit by Friday. That gave us 3 days. 3 days until the valley was tested. 3 days until Clint Thatcher's lessons came, not from me, but from gravity and runoff. The HOA called another board meeting for Wednesday night. I knew what it was about even before the email arrived. The subject line read, Urgent, Community Safety and Compliance Review. I almost laughed. The hypocrisy in that sentence was thicker than the storm clouds overhead. I arrived early again, this time dressed in my faded green utility jacket, the same one I used to wear when I oversaw slope stabilization projects along the Mississippi. In my hand, a sealed folder printed with time-stamped images of the dismantled drain forecasts from the hot National Weather Service, and a county flood risk overlay I'd annotated with a Sharpie. The room was fuller than usual. Word must have gotten around. People who normally didn't attend young couples' retirees even. The aloof dentist from the Hilltop lot filed in quietly, nodding to one another with uneasy smiles. I could feel the static in the air, not just from the storm, but from the mood, tense, expectant. Clint called the meeting to order with his usual rehearsed tone. Marlene sat beside him wearing a navy blue cardigan with gold buttons and a smirk that dared me to speak. When they opened the floor for discussion, I stood without waiting to be acknowledged. I'd like to address the board's decision to dismantle the storm mitigation I installed on my property, I began. Clint looked up from his agenda sheet, barely hiding his disdain. Mr. Reynolds, we've already. I'm not here to debate policy, I interrupted, voice firm. I'm here to warn you, again. A murmur moved through the room. I opened the folder and began handing out copies of my packet to the nearby residents. A few took them hesitantly, flipping through pages, like they were holding evidence at a trial, which in some ways they were. This is the updated rainfall forecast for Friday night, I continued. According to the National Weather Service, we're looking at sustained rainfall of over 2 inches per hour between 9 p.m. and midnight. That qualifies as a flash flood risk for our area. Marlene rolled her eyes. Clint leaned back in his chair. Let the record reflect, he said coolly, that Mr. Reynolds continues to present speculative weather predictions as justification for violating HOA landscaping codes. It's not speculation, I said, jaw tightening. It's probability, and it's responsibility. I pointed to the diagrams. Without that drain in place, the runoff from the north slope now has no controlled outlet. That means increased surface water soil displacement and backflow risk to any home below elevation line 452. That includes your property, Clint. Someone in the room snorted. A woman in the back raised her hand. Wait, is that why my backyard has been soggy for 2 days? I can't speak to your lot specifically, I said, but I can tell you this. The ground is already saturated. If that system isn't rebuilt or rerouted, the water will find its own path. It always does. Clint laughed. Actually laughed. A short, dismissive sound that echoed off the drop ceiling like a hammer on glass. Mr. Reynolds, this isn't a city planning commission. This is a neighborhood meeting. We operate under guidelines voted on and approved by the residents. If you wanted to build a flood canal, you should have moved to a farm. I stared at him for a long moment, heart pounding, but not with fear. With disbelief. You don't get it, I said quietly. You think this is about aesthetics, about control, but it's about risk and consequences. I have done everything I can to prevent this from becoming a problem. If you refuse to act, you'll own whatever happens next. Marlene tilted her head. Is that a threat, Mr. Reynolds? No, I said. It's a forecast. I sat down. The room was dead quiet. The board quickly moved on to other agenda items, paint samples, noise, complaints, an argument about mailbox sizes, but the tension never left. A few neighbors gave me grateful looks. One man even whispered, "Thanks for trying." But most just looked scared. And they should have been. That night I walked the street before bed, flashlight beam cutting across puddles already forming at the bottom of driveways. I checked the slope behind my house now, nothing but loose soil and an exposed scar where the drain used to be. I paced out the angles, calculating rough flow rates in my head. There was no fixing it in time. The board had made their choice, and soon the water would make theirs. By Thursday morning, the sky had darkened into something biblical. The air had a strange electric taste to it, like aluminum or old pennies. I could hear the robins going quiet, the leaves rustling harder than the wind accounted for. Nature always knows before we do. And as I stepped out onto my porch, pulling my hood over my head, I felt that deep internal pressure settle into my bones, the kind that tells you the world's about to shift. The ground was already soaked. My boots left a faint imprint in the grass, and the slope behind my property had begun to bleed mud slowly toward the lower curb. I traced the path of the runoff with my eyes, and imagined what it would have done had the drain still been there collected. It slowed it, guided it. Now it was just wild water. I tried not to let the anger rise again. What they took from me wasn't just a trench and a pipe. It was the quiet certainty I'd built with my own hands, the one safeguard against the memory of everything I'd lost. But what stung more wasn't the removal itself. It was the humiliation. After the HOA voted, they hadn't even let me handle it myself. They'd sent in the contractors like I was some rogue builder, some backyard vigilante, whose work needed to be erased like a stain. They'd arrived with shovels and trucks pulling up my carefully packed gravel, hauling off the pipe I had measured to the inch. I had asked to keep it at least that, but Marlene had waved her hand dismissively and said, "We can't risk you reinstalling it later." They'd carted it away like contraband. I'd stood there that day silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew saying it wouldn't matter. They didn't care that I was a licensed civil engineer with over 30 years of experience. They didn't care that I'd buried my mother's wedding album after the Arkansas flood, or that my daughter, only 12 at the time, had been afraid of rain for 2 years afterward. They didn't care that the very ground they were so desperate to beautify had once taught me what it means to start over. To them, I was just a homeowner out of compliance. By late afternoon, the first wave of the storm hit. A slow gray curtain of rain that turned everything glassy. I watched from the window as the street began to shine, water sliding down toward the storm drains, but it was heavier than they expected. The newscaster said 1 inch per hour, then 2. By 7 p.m., emergency alerts had been issued for surrounding counties. I walked out with my flashlight and began to document. I started with the rear slope, now a shallow river. The water wasn't violent yet, but it was relentless, carving tiny channels down the hill like fingers searching for weakness. I took photos, marking timestamps. I followed the flow past my property line down toward the sidewalk that curved behind Clint Thatcher's backyard. There the water pooled. Not much yet. Just enough to turn his stone pathway into a sheen of mud. I walked further past the Simons house, past the Connolly's mailbox, both sitting lower on the block, and snapped more photos. The storm drain at the end of the cul-de-sac was already sputtering. The city hadn't cleared them out before spring. Leaves, twigs, and debris were building a blockade. And there was nothing stopping it now. I returned home, downloaded all the footage to an external hard drive, backed it up twice, and sent a copy to my daughter with the subject line, just in case. I ate dinner alone, grilled cheese and soup, and listened to the wind pull at the gutters. At 9:37 p.m., the real storm arrived. It came like a freight train, fat, heavy drops slamming against the roof like fists. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the cabinets. I stepped outside into the chaos and was hit by a sheet of cold water. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet, but I could still hear it, something else louder than the rain. A deep, glugging sound from the street. I followed it. The water had breached the sidewalk. The runoff from the upper slope, with nowhere to go, had crossed into the Connolly's yard and was pushing against their garage door like a slow-motion battering ram. Next door, the Simons flower beds were underwater. But the worst was Clint's property. His carefully sculpted landscaping, the stones, the red mulch, the ornamental grass was gone. Washed clean off, replaced by a swirling, angry current that ran straight into his garage. His lights were on. I could see him through the window on the phone, pacing, shirt half soaked. He didn't see me standing in the rain across the street. But Marlene did. She burst out of her front door, barefoot, screaming something into the night, waving her arms like a conductor trying to halt a collapsing symphony. Her little decorative solar lights were floating across her front lawn. Her hydrangeas were gone. I stood there soaked, unmoving. She saw me and screamed, "Are you happy now?" Her voice cracked, panicked, like a child whose game turned real. I didn't answer. There was nothing to say. At 10:03 p.m., I heard the sirens. 2 fire trucks crawled into the neighborhood, their beams sweeping the street like searchlights. They slowed near the flooded homes, and firefighters stepped out in rain gear, shouting orders and inspecting basements. One house had water gushing from the foundation vents. Another had sandbags piled too late against the door. I didn't go near them. I didn't interfere. I just recorded. At 10:21 p.m., a firefighter knocked on my door. "You okay over here, sir?" I nodded, dry as a bone. He looked past me into the yard. No standing water. Nope. Any prior flooding issues? Not since I built the trench. He blinked. That one back there, we saw it in satellite overlay. Looked like it was designed to drain toward the street. It was, I said. He shook his head slowly. Smart. Shame it's not there anymore. I nodded once, a long, quiet breath in my chest. Yeah, shame. He left. I closed the door. The rain kept falling. And the HOA, they had finally gotten what they wanted. Control. Now they could sit in it neck deep. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed, but the damage had only just begun to speak. I awoke not to silence, but to the sound of generators humming across the valley like a low, groaning prayer. My power had stayed on my elevation, and preparation had bought me that much, but many of my neighbors weren't as fortunate. I walked outside with a thermos of black coffee and the calm detachment of a man who had seen this all before. The street was a shallow river, opaque brown and glistening under a cold sky that still hung heavy with clouds. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel fuel, and something faintly metallic like the leftover breath of a machine that had worked all night long. Tree limbs had fallen in the east cul-de-sac. Mailboxes leaned like broken necks. Lawn chairs bobbed like forgotten toys in driveways now marked by the tide. And there, standing in the middle of the road in soaked sneakers and a raincoat too short for her frame, was Marlene. She was staring at the drain, not mine, the HOA's. The city installed overburdened inlet at the end of the street that now gurgled like a dying throat clogged with debris and surrounded by inches of standing water that refused to move. Her arms hung slack at her sides, her hair a frizzed halo of defeat. I approached, slowly, boots slapping softly through puddles. She turned to me when I was within 10 feet. Her face looked drawn raw. No eyeliner, no cleverness, just exhaustion. "Clint's house flooded," she said. "No preamble, no defense." "I figured," I replied. "Basement, garage, even the lower level, completely gone." His wife's Lexus floated into the hedge. "And you were right about the Connolly's place, too. They've got black water up to the fuse box." I sipped my coffee. "And the Simons, about 4 inches in the kitchen." We stood there in silence. Behind us, a city worker lifted a rusted drain cover and began jabbing down into it with a hooked rod trying to dislodge the blockage. The water moved slightly but still lingered, like it had decided this was home now. "I didn't want this," Marlene said, almost in a whisper. "But you did," I answered softly. "You wanted me to be wrong." She swallowed hard and looked down at her shoes. "I told Clint," she said, her voice cracking. "I told him this was different. That you weren't just some crank." I said nothing. The truth didn't need help standing. After a moment, she asked, "Do you still have the plans?" I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Which plans?" "The drain. The one you built. The one they tore up." I paused. My answer would matter, and I knew it. "Yes," I said finally. "I do." She nodded slowly. Would you consider showing them to the city engineer? He's coming today." "I think we need help. Real help." It took everything in me not to laugh. Not cruelly. Not smugly. Just sadly. They had paved over logic, then begged it to come back when the water rose. "I'll consider it," I said. "But not for the HOA." She blinked, confused. "Then for who?" "For the families who got hit. For the people who didn't vote, who stayed quiet, who trusted the wrong people to make decisions for them." I didn't wait for her reply. I walked back to my house. As I crossed the threshold of my yard, I looked down. The grass was flat, but intact. The slight indentation where the trench had been was now just a muddy scar. But no pooling, no erosion. The land, like me, had survived. Inside, I opened my email and drafted a message to Aiden, the city engineer I'd spoken to earlier in the month. I attached the flood map, overlays the pictures of the damage I'd taken overnight, and my original drain design plans. Then I added a note, and this was preventable. I warned them. "I have time-stamped documentation of all warnings issued. I am willing to cooperate if the city pursues an investigation or infrastructure reevaluation. Please advise on next steps." I hit send. My hands were steady. An hour later, the city truck rolled into the neighborhood. Yellow decals, flashing lights. 2 workers in boots and jackets stepped out, followed by Aiden, clipboard in hand. He came straight to my house. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I got your email. We'll be reviewing the whole block, but what you gave us, that's gold." No one else was thinking downstream. Literally. "I tried," I said. I know he nodded. "Believe me, we deal with this all over the county. HOAs want to act like mini governments until a storm hits, and then suddenly, it's call the city." He walked with me along the yard, taking notes, snapping photos. Then I showed him where the drain had been marked with string flags I'd put back in just that morning. By noon, city workers had set up a small operations center near the clubhouse. The HOA board, what was left of it, was holed up inside. Clint hadn't shown his face. Word around the street was that his garage was a total loss, and his wife had packed a bag and left for her sisters. Marlene came by again late afternoon. She didn't ask for anything this time, just stood at the edge of my porch with her arms crossed. "They're talking about resignations," she said. "Clint's likely done." I didn't reply. "And the neighbors, they're angry. Some of them are talking about a petition to strip HOA control over drainage enforcement altogether." "They should," I said. "You were right," she whispered. "We were so focused on keeping things uniform, we forgot that nature doesn't care about appearance." "That's the thing about water," I said. "It's not interested in rules, only gravity." She gave a sad smile. "Would you be willing to help us redesign it?" I paused, watching the clouds stretch thin over the valley. The sun was finally peeking through a pale, hesitant light. "I'll think about it," I said. And for the first time in a long while, I meant it. By evening, the damage was more than visible. It was undeniable. What had started as creeping runoff in the early morning had grown into a full-scale infrastructure failure across the neighborhood. The cul-de-sac where kids used to ride bikes and neighbors gathered on warm nights had transformed into a miniature lake. Even with the rain tapering off, the water had nowhere to go. I watched it all from my porch. Residents wandered in and out of their homes, looking confused, angry, wet, and tired. Some tried sweeping water away with push brooms, futile, of course. One man was waist-deep near the intersection, trying to unclog a storm grate with a rake, while his wife shouted for him to come back inside. And across the street, the HOA clubhouse, the place where they voted to dismantle my drain, was surrounded by inches of standing water. The walkway had collapsed inward from soil erosion, and one of the benches had floated out into the street. The symbolism was too perfect. I put on my boots again and walked the block. Not to mock, not to gloat, just to see. I took more photos. I paused at the Simons home where water had receded, just enough to see the damage, a basement window cracked from pressure patio furniture strewn in strange places, and what looked like a soaked carpet hanging from the garage like a tongue. Mrs. Simons stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly around her chest. Her eyes were red, but she smiled weakly when she saw me. "I'm sorry," she said. "About everything." "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "But we all just stood by," she whispered. "We saw them tear it out. We heard what you said. And we didn't say anything." I shrugged gently. "People don't usually listen until water touches their feet." She laughed just once bitterly. Down the hill, I could see more city trucks arriving. Public Works had cordoned off part of the street with cones, and a large vacuum pump truck was setting up to help extract pooled water from storm drains that had long since given up. Aiden waved at me across the way, clipboard still under his arm. But it wasn't the city's activity that made me stop. It was the sound. Sobbing. I turned toward the source and saw Clint. He was kneeling in his driveway, water up to his shins, trying to pull wet drywall out of his garage by hand. His suit jacket, who the hell wore a suit jacket in a flood, was soaked and clung to his back like a second skin. His phone lay face down in the water beside him. A box of what looked like family photos was half submerged nearby. He looked up as I approached, eyes glassy and dazed. I stood in silence a safe few paces away. I had no desire to shame him. Nature had already done that. "I was wrong," he said hoarsely. I said nothing. "I thought you were overreacting, making it personal." "It was never personal," I replied. "It was mathematical." He blinked, water dripping from his hairline. "I don't know what to do." "You start by admitting you didn't know what you were doing." He nodded slowly. "Marlene says you might help the neighborhood rebuild the system." "I'm considering it." Another silence fell between us, broken only by the rhythmic slosh of the pump truck up the road. Finally, he added, "It's just, when you're used to being the smartest guy in the room, it's hard to admit you never understood the room at all." I exhaled. "That's the first smart thing I've heard you say." He gave a soft, humorless laugh. "I'll leave you to it," I said, turning back toward the street. "City's got questions for the board. You'll want to answer them carefully." That evening, the HOA emergency group chat, one I'd been blocked from for months, was leaked to several residents. Screenshots circulated like wildfire. One message in particular caught everyone's attention. It was from Clint just days before the storm. "If we let Reynolds get away with this trench crap, every nerd with a shovel will start digging like they own the place. He's not a threat. He's a distraction." A distraction. I couldn't have asked for a better headline. By Friday morning, the neighborhood had shifted from panic to fury. A few homes were still pumping water out, but the sun had returned in full force, casting brutal light on what was broken and who had broken it. A town hall was hastily scheduled for that afternoon, open air on the greenbelt above the flood line. Residents gathered in folding chairs. The city was present. Aiden gave a short but damning presentation, complete with drone photos, water flow simulations, and a rundown of prior warnings the HOA had ignored. Then the microphone was passed around. People didn't hold back. They demanded resignations. They demanded transparency. They demanded someone explain why the only man who saw it coming had been punished instead of listened to. Marlene stepped up first. She was shaking, voice thin but audible. "I was wrong. I prioritized uniformity over safety. I thought I was doing what was best for the neighborhood." Someone shouted, "You destroyed our homes." Another added, "You ignored the science. He gave you maps." Clint didn't speak. He just sat in the back row, face pale, eyes locked on the horizon. Marlene stepped away from the mic, clearly fighting tears. Then, to everyone's surprise, the mayor himself, drawn in by the local news coverage, took the stage. "I've reviewed the documentation," he said, "and I want to make it clear that while the HOA does have autonomy in certain matters, it does not have the right to overrule safety or interfere with private efforts that mitigate risk in accordance with code. This was preventable. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was negligence." Gasps. A few cheers. Clint finally dropped his head into his hands. Then the mayor looked toward me. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, "would you be willing to consult with the city to design a solution for this neighborhood moving forward?" A hush fell over the crowd. I stood. My legs were heavy, but my voice was calm. "I'll help, but only if we focus on education, not just engineering. People need to understand why these systems matter, not just for property values, but for peace of mind." The mayor nodded, agreed. I sat back down. The air felt lighter. The storm had come and it had left a mess, but also strangely a kind of clarity. The neighborhood for once was finally listening. It didn't take long for the narrative to shift. By Sunday, what had once been whispered apologies had turned into outright declarations. Neighbors who barely made eye contact with me weeks ago were suddenly offering coffee lawn tools, even help replanting the section of my yard that had been torn up. People wanted to be on the right side of the story now, and I understood why. No one wants to be remembered as the person who stood still while the flood came. Even Marlene. She showed up at my door that morning, holding a Tupperware container with something homemade, lemon bars, I think. Her eyes were softer now, stripped of the edge she once carried like armor. She wasn't wearing her usual HOA blue blazer. No clipboard, no tone of superiority. Just Marlene. Human. "I brought these for you," she said. "I didn't move to take them." She lowered her eyes. "I know I was wrong. I know that now. We were trying to keep the neighborhood consistent, safe in our own way. But I see now it was pride and fear." I finally took the container not for the lemon bars, but for what it symbolized. "It's not just about the water," I said. "It never was." "I know," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. "It's about control. About people like me thinking we can manage nature by committee." I stepped outside and sat on the porch bench. She followed, standing at a cautious distance, like someone approaching a cliff edge. "I went through something like this before," I said, looking out toward the street. "Back in Arkansas. My daughter and I lost everything in a flash flood. The insurance adjuster called it an act of God. But really, it was an act of neglect, of shortcuts, of people not listening when warnings were given." Marlene sat down slowly on the porch steps. "I never knew that," she said. "I didn't share it. Not with anyone here. It's hard to talk about." A silence settled between us, and then gently she asked, "Do you think the board will survive this?" I shook my head. "Not in its current form. And maybe that's for the best." She looked down at her hands. "I've already drafted my resignation letter. It's just sitting in my drafts. I wanted to deliver it at the next meeting." "That would be the right thing," I said. "But I also want to stay to help fix it, to make sure we never do this to anyone else again." I studied her face, searching for sincerity. I found it. Worn maybe, but real. "I think that depends on whether you're ready to listen instead of enforce." She nodded. Before she left, she handed me a small folder. It's everything she said. Internal emails, board texts, even the vote record. I thought the city might want to see it. I flipped through the first few pages. What I saw made my jaw tighten. Messages that mocked my concerns, that joked about science, Boy Reynolds, and his trench of doom. References to deliberately ignoring my packet. There was even an internal vote to raise the fine on me, not based on policy, but to set an example. She saw the look on my face. "I didn't vote for that part," she whispered. "But I didn't stop it either." I nodded. "Thank you for bringing this. It'll help." Later that day, I forwarded the folder to the city engineer and CC'd the mayor's assistant. I didn't attach any commentary. The messages spoke for themselves. Within 48 hours, the city issued a public memo announcing a formal investigation into the HOA's board practices, specifically regarding their handling of stormwater policy and resident retaliation. A lawyer named Cynthia Vega from the Municipal Oversight Committee was assigned to the case. She reached out to me personally, calm and precise, thanking me for my meticulous documentation. "Frankly, Mr. Reynolds," she said, "you built a stronger case than we usually get from whistleblowers in commercial zoning disputes." I asked her if it could lead to anything concrete. "Fines forced, board restructuring, maybe even a city-appointed supervisor to oversee the HOA until new elections can be held," she said. "It depends how far it goes." Clint resigned 2 days later. No press conference, no speech, just a folded piece of paper handed to the interim secretary and an email sent to the residents with the subject line, "Stepping aside." No apology, but no denial either. I saw him once more that week down at the community greenbelt where the city had begun installing a temporary retention system. He looked older, deflated. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just passed each other like strangers on a sidewalk, the kind that know each other's pain but no longer need to speak it. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to change. At first, it was subtle. Conversations that used to stop when I walked by now continued. People started asking questions, real ones, about slope angles, about runoff, about native plants that could help with water absorption. A young couple on the corner even asked me to help them build a smaller version of my trench on their lot. Then came the town emails. The new acting board proposed a neighborhood workshop, Storm Safety and Water Wisdom, and asked me to co-lead it with Aiden from the city. I nearly declined, but something in me softened. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Simon showed up at my door with a thank you card signed by half the block. Maybe it was the boy on his bike who waved at me and yelled, "Hey, you're the guy who stopped the flood," in a voice full of awe. Or maybe I just wanted to finally feel like my voice mattered here. I said yes. The night before the workshop, I stood out on my back lawn, flashlight in hand, and surveyed the slope once more. The string flags were still there, flapping gently in the wind, like little declarations of resilience. And beneath them, I could see the outline. Where the drain used to be, the trench, the gravel, the pipe, all gone now. But the ground remembered. So did I. And soon so would they. The community center was packed. More people than I'd ever seen attend a single HOA meeting. Folding chairs stretched from the dusty linoleum floor all the way back to the fire exit, where even latecomers leaned against the wall nodding quietly. There were retirees in worn cardigans, young families with toddlers bouncing on their laps, and teenagers who probably didn't even know what a floodplain was until now. At the front of the room, Aiden stood beside me in a button-down shirt and khakis, clicking through a PowerPoint on the projector screen. His voice was steady and clear, more teacher than bureaucrat. And this slide here shows what happens when stormwater infrastructure is compromised. In this case, we're talking about topography infiltration and interception points being altered. Now, let's zoom in. This overlay shows Pine Hollow during the April 12th event post-drain removal. As you can see, a murmur rippled through the crowd as the image changed to a thermal-colored gradient. Clint's house glowed red. Mine was dry. Aiden nodded toward me, stepping back. Now Tom Reynolds has generously agreed to walk us through the local realities. I took a breath. My knees ached slightly from standing too long, but I stepped forward anyway. This isn't about blaming, I began. It's about understanding, about what water does when it's not given a proper path. You've seen it. You've felt it. Now let's talk about how to prevent it. I walked them through all the slope analysis I had done years ago when I bought the property. I showed the hand-drawn plans I'd submitted to the HOA plans they ignored. I explained how a simple French drain system like mine, built with gravel and pipe and properly graded soil, could redirect hundreds of gallons of runoff safely into the city's gutter system without damaging adjacent lots. And I didn't stop there. I clicked to the next slide. Timeline of warnings, email dates, screenshots, HOA minutes, the letter from the city engineer, my annotated flood projection sent before the storm. I watched people shift in their seats, eyes widening. This, I said, pointing at the list, is what accountability looks like. Not anger, not vengeance, just facts. A hand went up near the back. It was Mr. Lockett, a retired Army colonel who never said more than a few words at past meetings. What about the HOA, he asked. Can we legally remove their authority over safety issues? Aiden stepped in. Great question. The city is pursuing oversight at the moment. There's a pending motion that would reclassify stormwater infrastructure under municipal jurisdiction rather than HOA discretion, at least in designated risk zones. This neighborhood qualifies. Cheers broke out. Not wild ones, measured weary relief. People clapped in that way, where hands meet with both gratitude and regret. Another voice piped up. Mrs. Connolly, still visibly shaken from the flooding of her ground floor. What happens to the people who ignored the warnings? Aiden hesitated, but I stepped forward again. That's not my decision to make. And frankly, it's not what matters most anymore. What matters is making sure no one else loses a family photo album or their kids' first toys or their peace of mind because someone thought rules were more important than reason. The room went silent. Then Mrs. Connolly stood and she clapped. One by one, others rose, joining her. By the time the meeting ended, the sign-up sheet for our upcoming workshop on community resiliency had over 60 names. I offered to personally walk through the topography of anyone's lot who wanted help. I'd even started sketching out a volunteer network, people with different skills all pitching in to make Pine Hollow safer. But the city had other plans too. 2 weeks later, they returned, not with temporary sandbags or cones, but with survey equipment, site planners, and a public grant application already approved. Pine Hollow was being designated as a storm-responsive neighborhood, the first of its kind in the county. The city would install a new green infrastructure system, permeable pathways, rain gardens, bioswales, and had asked me to be the lead community advisor on the project. They offered a stipend. I turned it down. "I'm not doing this for money," I told them. "I'm doing it because I can't let another kid go to sleep afraid of the rain like my daughter once did." Aiden smiled. "Then you're exactly who we need." Meanwhile, the HOA board continued to crumble. Clint's departure had left a vacuum, and Marlene's resignation letter, finally submitted, was read aloud at the next official gathering. She didn't sugarcoat it. I failed to listen. I failed to understand. And in doing so, I endangered this community. It ended with a plea that the new board do better. No one applauded, but no one scoffed either. Some changes were symbolic. The community clubhouse was temporarily renamed the Hollow Commons, and now hosted weekend discussions on everything from native plant landscaping to water-wise design. The old sign that read, "Pine Hollow HOA, Order through Consistency," was taken down and replaced with a new one, yet Pine Hollow, built to withstand. But some changes were deeply personal. Mrs. Simons planted a tree in her backyard where her flooded flower beds used to be. She named it Grace. Mr. Lockett replaced his sidewalk with permeable pavers and invited the neighborhood kids to help lay them, turning it into a kind of game. And me, I started walking again in the evenings. Not pacing, not patrolling, just walking. It was on one of those walks that I saw Clint again. He was at the far edge of the neighborhood, parked outside what used to be his pristine garage. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans, boots, and a windbreaker. He saw me, but didn't wave. I nodded once. He nodded back. And that was enough. Sometimes accountability doesn't come in a courtroom. Sometimes it comes when a man kneels in the mud and sees what the water took not just from others, but from himself. Spring arrived with a kind of softness we hadn't earned. The trees bloomed anyway, unbothered by our petty politics, their roots reaching quietly beneath soil, still reshaped by flood. Life, it seemed, continued. But we were different. Pine Hollow wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a story. One whispered between residents, shared on news broadcasts, even featured in a community resilience blog that called us an accidental case study in the cost of ignoring science. I didn't care about the recognition. I cared that the ground didn't squelch beneath my boots anymore, that the air no longer smelled like mold and denial, that when rain appeared in the forecast, people no longer flinched, they prepared, because they finally understood that water doesn't negotiate. It just is. I spent my mornings at the edge of the slope behind my property, rebuilding not the exact same trench, but something better. Aided by a grant and 2 city interns, I designed a swale that looked like a natural curve of land framed with stones and planted with sedges and switchgrass. It absorbed runoff like a sponge and whispered with frogs at dusk. The city planned to replicate it in 4 other neighborhoods. Neighbors came to watch. Kids rode their bikes past it and called it the mini river. A few even asked if I could teach them how to build one for their own yards, so I did. One Saturday turned into 3. I drew sketches in chalk on driveways, used toy models to explain grade and runoff, and helped an elderly widow install a rain barrel that she now brags about to everyone who will listen. I never meant to become the neighborhood's water guy. But here I was, no longer an outsider, just Tom. At the first community meeting under the new board, I was invited not as a cautionary tale, but as an advisor. Aiden introduced me with a quiet smile, and a sentence I never expected to hear. "This man saved your basements and your dignity." People laughed. It was the good kind of laughter, warm, present, generous. I nodded awkwardly and said something about geology and gratitude, but my voice cracked halfway through. Not from sadness, from relief. Afterward, Mrs. Connolly brought me a basket of homemade sourdough. "My kitchen's dry now," she said, "because of you." Even Marlene sent a card. No return address, just a handwritten note on plain paper. "You were right. I hope we all remember what happens when we listen too late. Thank you for not giving up." I kept it in the back of my weather journal, tucked between soil reports and rainfall charts. Not because I needed it, but because reminders matter. Even for the strong ones. Then one morning, a knock at my door. It was Aiden again, only this time not with a clipboard, but with a certificate from the State Office of Environmental Affairs. He said, "You've been named a Community Steward of the Year. They want to highlight Pine Hollow as a turnaround story, and they want you to speak at the regional summit." I stared at the embossed paper, then at him. "You sure they've got the right guy?" He laughed. "Absolutely. You took a trench, a pipe, and a problem and turned it into a movement. And frankly, we could use more people like you." I didn't say yes right away. I thought about it for a while, talking in front of strangers about a storm that almost broke me. But then I remembered the fear in Marlene's eyes, the silence in Clint's driveway, and the way the kids pointed to the swale and said, "That's where the water goes now." So I said yes. The summit was held in a downtown conference center surrounded by glass buildings and curated flower beds that hadn't seen real runoff in years. I stood behind a podium under soft lights, looking out at rows of city planners, council members, and engineers in matching lanyards. I told them our story not with drama, but with detail. I showed them the photos, the flooded street, the floating mulch, the cracked walkways. And then I showed them the after, the swale, the gardens, the workshop flyers pinned to community boards. And I ended with this. "And we thought we were safe because we had rules, but safety doesn't come from control, it comes from listening. To data, to warnings, to people who've seen the water rise before. We didn't build a stronger neighborhood because we enforced more rules. We built it because we finally asked the right questions. And we stopped being afraid of the answers." When I stepped off the stage, people stood. Not because I was eloquent, because they saw themselves in the flood. Back home, things continued to heal. Clint sold his house and moved across town. I heard he took a job in logistics, something far from community management. Marlene stayed. She volunteers now, running a booth at every HOA meeting with flyers about flood preparedness and green gardening tips. The Connolly's son just finished high school with a scholarship in environmental sciences. Says he wants to study what Mr. Reynolds knows. The trench behind my house is now on the county registry, a permanent fixture. My name is listed as the original designer. I never thought the most important thing I'd leave behind wouldn't be a legacy or a name, just a channel, one that carried away the water and the fear. And in its place, something sturdy, something green, something quiet. Justice not with a gavel, but with a shovel.